Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video on History Valley Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Gad Barnea. Dr. Gad Barnea is a lecturer at the University of Haifa and a research fellow at the Bible and its Traditions, a research project at the École biblique et archéologique Française de Jerusalem. He studies the history and evolution of Yahwism, as well as its offshoots, such early Judaism, early Christianity, and related cultic practices and traditions, especially in the context with the Iranian Age of Empires. From Achaemenid to the Sassanid empires, he is a published author and has published several articles in his field and related fields. In parallel, Dr. Barnea is an accomplished epigraphist and philologist specializing in Aramaic epigraphy, as well as Semitic and Iranian linguistics and their interactions. He has recently restored a scroll from Qumran that contains a previously unknown Achaemenid court legend to be published in Brill's DSSE collection. In December 2022, he organized a three-day international interdisciplinary symposium in memory of the late Professor Shakid, which was dedicated to the study of the touch points between diverse Yahwistic communities throughout the Achaemenid Empire and the Iranian attributes of the empire that ruled over them for about 2 centuries. And today's interview is based upon Yahwism under the Achaemenid Empire. Gad Barnea co-edited the book with Professor Reinhard Krautz. The link to purchase the book will be in the affiliate link in the description below and in the pinned comment, as well as a link to the open access version of the book. And that being said, welcome to History Valley Podcast, Professor Gad Barnea.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what your upcoming book is about?
Sure. So the book is the result of the work we've done in our conference that you just mentioned from December 22. That conference was very unique in many ways because it was dedicated to the study of Yahwism, and we'll talk obviously about Yahwism as well, what I mean by that. But Yahwism under the Achaemenid Empire. So a very, very specific context and a very specific cultic phenomenon called Yahwism, which is fascinating in its own right and goes far beyond the Achaemenid period. Now, this conference and the book as well is very interdisciplinary. So it has biblical scholars, but it also has historians. It has epigraphers, it has archaeologists involved, it has linguists involved, it has Iranists, people who specialize only in the history, either history or cultic history of Iran. Also, we have one archaeologist who is an archaeologist not of biblical archaeology, so to speak, but actually of the Iranian world. And so it's very interdisciplinary, and usually people from these different disciplines don't really get together. I mean, archaeologists and biblical scholars can get together, of course, but not necessarily with Iranists and not necessarily with linguists. And so getting all of these different profiles together, different specialties, different knowledge backgrounds, and experiences, that was really a fantastic conference. And the book, and what we wanted to do is that the book would not be just like a proceedings book. It's not basically just taking the different papers, the lectures that were presented at the conference, and putting them in book form, which is often what you have at the end of a conference. What we wanted to do is to look at the conference as a 3-day workshop where we exchange ideas. We present papers, of course, but we also exchange ideas and grow together and learn from each other, so that our individual contributions to the book ultimately are more than just the individual papers that we presented. I'm sure I'll have a link in the YouTube because we have recordings from the conference, and that would be a very good place for your listeners and viewers to start, and just to watch these earlier paper presentations from the conference, and that would give everybody a very good background in anticipation for the book. The book is supposed to come out around the end of October early November, between the 21st of October and 4th of November, something like that. So we're working on getting everything done. It's going to be a pretty large book, about over 600 pages, but a lot full of absolute treasures from really the best, the greatest scholars today in the field.
So the book does it explore parallels between early Judaism, Yahwism, with the Persian religion as well?
Yes, yes. So, of course. So that's a big part of the book, especially for me. That's my main area of research. I mean, my main area. I study Zoroastrianism also in its own right, not just in when it in touch with or in dialogue with Judaism. So I study also Zoroastrianism, which is a fascinating study in its own right. Early Zoroastrianism. Really, my focus is on pre-Islamic Persia, pre-Islamic Iranian empires, whether they work. I mean, of course, a big part of that, kind of a subsection of that, is their interaction with the Jewish people, but again, not only. So this conference certainly deals, and several papers deal with with Zoroastrianism in the Achaemenid Empire, which I simply call Achaemenid Zoroastrianism, because of course it's different from modern day Zoroastrianism, and it's different even from Sasanian Zoroastrianism. So I just call it Achaemenid Zoroastrianism, and several contributors to the book deal with how to define that, and what can we be sure was characteristic of Achaemenid Zoroastrianism. And then, of course, the dialogue, or really at that point, just the influence that Achaemenid Zoroastrianism has on Judaism. In the Achaemenid period, the influence is really one way. Okay, the empire is influencing the province. So the Achaemenid Empire is the one influencing the province of Samaria and the province of Yahud. In later periods, there is also influence back from Judaism. Now I'm talking about the Sasanian period, back from certain Jewish concepts back to the Zoroastrian world of ideas. But in the Achaemenid period, we're really talking about a one-way street in terms of influence. And the Achaemenid Zoroastrianism was a very powerful force. We see it really throughout the empire. We have echoes of it everywhere, and its impact in various ways on humanity in general is huge. Again, not just on the Jewish people, not just on the Bible, but of course also, and that is a fascinating topic to research.
What would you say would be some a couple of very good examples of parallels between Zoroastrianism and Judaism?
That's a great question. Usually people would say monotheism is a good parallel. And in a way that is correct, because they are as monotheistic as the other, but none of them is really monotheistic. Strict monotheism is strict monotheism in the sense that of absolute in everything that it means, with everything that it means. Absolute oneness of the deity is an Islamic development of the Tawheed in Islam, and influencing later Judaism in that direction as well. But the form of, kind of softer monotheism, and there are different terms. Henotheism, that doesn't really apply here. Monolatry doesn't really apply either directly. So it's really hard to find a direct an exact definition for what was. But there was a main deity, and in both cases, both in the Achaemenid worldview and in Judaism, these things were very, very fluid. They changed and they changed over time. By the way, it's really important also to note, and I think it'll be interesting to your listeners. Uh, we often assume that monotheism is a linear development. People were quote unquote polytheist, and then the positive evolution was towards a monotheistic profile for the community. That is certainly not the case. Communities vacillated between periods where they veered more towards monotheism, and then periods where they veered more towards something with more multiple deities. So, and even with the Achaemenid Empire, we have in the early period, in Darius and Xerxes' day, they had Ahura Mazda as pretty much the only deity. Sometimes they say the other gods that exists. They mention other deities elsewhere. They are cognizant that other deities exist, but for them it's all Ahura Mazda. Only after Artaxerxes II, from 404 BCE onwards, do we start to having multiple deities within the Achaemenid inscriptions, within Achaemenid propaganda. We have Ahura Mazda together with Mithra and Anahita, for example. So here we have an example of people moving from soft monotheism, if you want to call it that way, and to a more poly or more multiple deities, or triad in this case. And in fact, there are hints that at the end of Artaxerxes the second reign for a long time, at the end of his towards the end of his reign, there are hints that he moved back to a more monotheistic form for his propaganda. So all this to say that also when we look at biblical texts, when we look at early Judaism or Yahwism, we always need to keep in mind that things are always in the flux, always change, always, and also not just in time, but also in place. Okay, there are different places that accept more of a, something that is more monotheistic, and places that are less monotheistic, but they're still the same cultic within the same cultic sphere. Things are a lot more flexible, a lot more complex, and frankly, a lot more interesting than we usually think. And that's one thing also that's really common and really at the same level. Other features, well, a certain apocalyptic thought. I wouldn't say that it's the fully developed or the more developed apocalyptic thought, but apocalyptic thought and eschatology, these are things that developed to some extent in Zoroastrianism prior to their development in Judaism, and certainly had some impact on the development. But again, as I said, there seem to be influences later on, back from Judaism to later apocalyptic thought in Zoroastrianism. So that's a long-term effect, which is eventually also two-way. So you have eschatology, apocalyptic thought, the idea of a life, life to come, an eternal life that you have to merit if you are righteous. Arta in the Achaemenid jargon. So the Arta is the good order, the order of the cosmic order, the truth, and Arta is a person who is possessed by Arta. And so this person is blessed according to Xerxes, already from Xerxes, the Daiwa inscription of Xerxes. That person who is an Arta has a blessed life in this life, and he says also after death. And so the idea of kind of bridge, that's later in Judaism, and later, I mean, post-biblical period in Judaism, and also in later Zoroastrianism. So there's a lot of things, a lot of symbiosis, if you will, between these two cults. when I say cult, I don't mean cult in the modern sense. Okay, it's not a cult. I'm talking about because I'm just using this word because religion is a little bit anachronistic. So I'm not using this in terms of in the modern sense cult, but basically just a cultic system, if you will. So there's a lot. They were really symbiotic, and we need to understand that the Jews in general lived many Jews, not of course not all of them. There was a diaspora elsewhere as well in the Roman world, but many Jews lived under the successive um, Iranian empires for over a millennium. So the relationship between these between them and the empire that ruled over them are very complex and very and of course very impactful on Jewish thought and Jewish history as well.
So, did they derive the idea of monotheism from them then?
Um, I mean, many scholars think that they did. Again, I'm just
Mhm.
making it very again clear that this is not monotheism in the way we think today, strict monotheism. But yes, I think that the idea of monotheism to the extent that it is expressed, for example, in Darius the First and Darius the Second, all the way to Artaxerxes the Second. So we're talking about Darius the First, Xerxes, Artaxerxes the First, Darius the Second, and all the way up to, and probably Darius II already started to develop in the direction that eventually we know in Artaxerxes II. But that form of Judaism seems to be almost certainly an influence from the Achaemenid Zoroastrian worldview. Yeah, so that is a now I just want to make clear something we talked about earlier about Yahwism specifically. Um, Yahwism is the basically the cult of Yah of Yahweh or Yahu, YHW. Okay, and so Yahu is the head of the pantheon. He's not necessarily the only deity. He's not necessarily the only deity for the ethnic deity for the Jews either. Okay, for the Yahwists, really, we don't really talk about Jews yet. And so Yahweh is a deity, an ethnic deity, just like any other deity in the ancient period. Um, and that is a very complex system, also with rites, temples, sacrifices, a certain theology, a certain form of magic, curses, and things like that, and a hierarchy of priests and hierarchy of participants in this cult, and things like that. So that is early Yahwism. Judaism spawned off from Yahwism. It did not replace it. Judaism spawned off Yahwism starting in the 3rd century BCE, and really becoming something recognizable to us today in the 2nd century BCE in the Hasmonean period. Now, what I mean by this is a form of Yahwism that has laws governing daily life, okay, that are recognizable from the Torah, that has authoritative scriptures, okay, things like that. That is what defines Judaism, and that is a kind of a spin-off from Yahwism. Yahwism continued while Judaism was developing. Yahwism continued well into the Roman period, and in a sense also continues to this day, also in the kind of the substratum of Judaism. But Yahwism is, if you will, the original, if I dare to use that word, the original form of what eventually became Judaism.
So basically, before they were influenced by the Zoroastrian version of monotheism. Yahoo was just another god among many gods, but he was essentially the chief of the Judean pantheon, is basically what you're saying, correct?
He was the head of the pantheon.
Hmm.
Other deities were equally, not equally. Let me rephrase that. Other deities also existed, and also people took oaths in their name, and were seen as affecting their daily life. But certainly Yahweh was the main deity. The main theophoric element in the names of Yahwist is still Yahu, but it's not exclusive. And the temple in Elephantine, for example, is the temple to Yahweh, not to other deities of the Yahwists. Of course, there were other temples in the area, but they were not part of the Yahwistic community there. So yeah, Yahweh was certainly the head of the pantheon, the main god, the main ethnic god, also reflected in the names, but not certainly not exclusive. Yeah, that's now that continued in parallel to the formation of the soft monotheism that we know from the Bible. Something like Second Isaiah, for example, people often point to that as a monotheistic or a more monotheistic text, even though it's not. There are certain passages there in the core of Second Isaiah that are not monotheistic. But people tend to gloss over this and look at that look at it as a monotheistic text. But as these texts were elaborated and developed, most Yahwists still continued in their old ways. And in fact, we do see that in the Bible, that the prophets or words that were put in the mouth of the prophets often criticize people who continue with the earlier form, their contemporary form of Yahwism. That continued also into the 4th century BCE and into the 3rd century BCE. And as I said, in fact, the what we call Judaism, again, the kind of the Torah-based or the religion of Judaism, which spawned off from Yahwism, lived side by side Yahwism for a long period of time. And in fact, if we were to go back to the Roman Empire, to the 1st century BCE, and then to this 4th or 5th century of the Common Era, by far the most popular form of Yahwism would not be Judaism or Christianity. It would be Yahwism, which continued to develop as well. But Yahwism with a constellation of deities under Yahweh, and that we see that in medallions, in different Roman texts, in different magic formula, all across the empire. By far the most popular form, and we see this in the Church Fathers talking about against phenomena like that. So Yahwism was a very important force in antiquity, and we're well into late antiquity, and a substratum of that, as I said, continues to this day.
So did the Persian influence or Achaemenid influence upon the Judeans begin when they were freed, when the Babylonian captivity ended and Cyrus took over a territory?
Okay, that's a great question. Look, we don't know speaking as a historian. There is no historical proof, quite to the contrary, that Cyrus ever thought of the Jewish people as a people that he has to deal with specifically or free. So we don't have any apart from the Bible, we don't have any external proof that Cyrus actually freed them or decreed that they should go back. In fact, also, we don't have a lot of proof that a lot of people did go back. Very few people did. Very few Jews did, and many of them stayed well into the 5th century and beyond. And so that is, we need to be very, very careful with that story, because again, there's not a lot of, there's no historical support really for that. No, I think that it's not specifically something like that at this early stage. I think it's simply that the Achaemenid period was the Achaemenid Empire in general was a cataclysmic phenomenon in the ancient world. The Achaemenids, this is the first superpower in the world. It's not we had the Neo-Assyrian Empire, we had other empires, of course. Egypt was an empire in a different way. We of course had for a short period of time the Neo-Babylonian empires and other local empires, but nothing even close to the Achaemenid Empire. Not just in terms of the geographic extent, which is larger than the Roman Empire. Okay, but also the ideology behind it and the effectiveness of its propaganda that was sent throughout the empire, that people were really interested in and absorbed. Now, you mentioned the book, the scroll that I restored from Qumran that has an Achaemenid tale in it. That scroll that was found in Qumran is basically a legend, contains a legend, a court tale, and the purpose of this court tale is to explain via legend, via parables, a passage from the Bisutun inscription of Darius I. Okay, but that's found in Qumran, from the late 1st century BCE, or I date it to the early century CE. Okay, and so that is and even at that period, at that point, that was still these passages from Bisutun were still very popular. And again, the fact that we find this in Qumran, in Cave 4, and in Qumran, where most of the scrolls were found, is absolutely astounding. And it goes to show just how popular the Achaemenid propaganda was, this sharing of ideas. Achaemenid propaganda impacted Egyptian thought, Egyptian laws. It, of course, impacted Greek thought significantly as well. So we are dealing here with a phenomenon that could not leave anyone indifferent. Okay, and the Jews were living within this. The Jews / Yahwists were living within this sphere, and interacting like all other people, interacting with it, assimilating it to their own world. Influence never goes just wholesale adoption. Okay, there's always a dialogue. So you adopt some ideas and you reject others, and so that is what we find also in the Bible. That was what we find in firsthand extra biblical texts as well from that period.
I also would like to ask about Ezra. Is there any historicity, is there any reliability in the story that Ezra brought out a Torah under the direction of an Achaemenid emperor?
No. The short answer is there isn't, and it is not something that we would assume. I mean, being a historian of the Achaemenid period, the Achaemenids were completely hands-off cultic practices. So it would be something that goes completely against their character. They simply did not get into this level of detail. They didn't care. As long as you paid the taxes and you did not revolt, you were okay. And so they really did. It would be very uncharacteristic. I can't say that it did not happen, of course. All I can say is that there is no evidence for it at all, and it would be completely against the character of Achaemenid rulers to interfere or to even care about, this, the certain books, certain texts, certain characteristics that that a certain provincial um, um, you know community has. And so so it does not seem historical for these reasons. And also, I mean, the letters that are mentioned there that are sent, anyone who is, I know that there are scholars who believe that these are authentic, but really anyone who actually works day in and as an epigrapher, I work day in and day out in Achaemenid letters and messages and ostraca, papyri, and all of these things. Anyone who's really familiar with these firsthand documents will find these will find the letters in Ezra to simply be not representative of what you would expect from that period. And a scholar, I won't mention names, but a scholar made a very good analogy, and he said, if we found today papyri with the texts that we have from Ezra, we would immediately declare them forgeries. Okay. So they do not fit. So clearly they were written even by someone who was so far removed from Achaemenid administration that they really did not know even how to emulate Achaemenid style texts anymore. Yeah.
So a lot of people that are not very familiar with this topic, or even familiar with the critical scholarship that's been done on this and on the Torah, will be like, "Oh, shouldn't the Torah be already well known, super well known?" Or some will say that, "Oh, they think Moses wrote it." Um, but when one begins to look into the matter, um, it's hard to find a Torah. Um, in those different early time periods that other people want to believe it existed. So my question is, do you have thoughts on when the Torah was composed?
Yes, I do, and I've already shared them in several places, and I'm happy to
Hmm.
share them again. So let me start by saying there is zero evidence of not just the Torah, but any part of the Bible that we are familiar with, or anything that might be scriptural in character, um, before let's say the late or really the third century BCE. Really, we start seeing some hints. Um, Maybe just the tail end of the fourth century BCE, if we accept certain texts that are quoted much later. And if we assume that there is no later interference in those texts, we can say maybe at the tail end of the fourth century and into the third century BCE, we start seeing some hints of the existence of something like the Torah. And so now I am not saying that there wasn't anything somewhere, somewhere um, in certain circles circulating around that eventually would make it into the Torah. Maybe oral traditions. Oral traditions are very strong and very important, and of course, also the Achaemenid, the Zoroastrian texts were transmitted orally for centuries, and so oral transmission of stories and sacred texts and things like that certainly should not be discounted, and I'm sure existed in certain circles, except that we have no record of that. Even if it was transmitted orally, we don't have any record that people actually knew these texts and certainly did not consider them effective in their lives. We do have a lot of cases of people doing things that are completely contrary to the laws of the Torah and to things that are stipulated in the Bible in general. And we do have a lot of that, but we don't have one positive example. Now, every one of these negative examples of things going against the Torah, we can excuse away. We can say, well, maybe he did that. Maybe he wanted to do this. For example, in Wadi Dalia. Wadi Dalia is a cave in the Samaria area, about 14 kilometers to the northwest of Jericho. In 1962, scholars found some papyri there. These are all deeds of slave sales between individuals, but they were Yahwists selling other Yahwists as slaves to other Yahwists. Okay, this goes squarely against the Torah, of course, of selling a Hebrew slave, if you will. And so now you can say, well, maybe these people, for them, money was more important than observing the Torah. Okay, so for them, it was more important, and that's how we explain them going squarely against Torah stipulations. But again, we have that is one example out of dozens that we have of people going against the Torah, but we don't have one positive example of people knowing, either quoting from the Torah, using idiomatic expressions. For example, contracts that have 2 or 3 witnesses. We don't have any of this, and so we, as a historian, I have to conclude that there was no Torah per se in the Yahwistic world prior to the 3rd century BC. Now, what happened and I'm writing another book on that. What happened, I believe, is that the next cataclysmic event, intellectually speaking, I mean, so the first one was the Achaemenid inscriptions that were promulgated throughout the empire and really impacted the way people thought throughout the empire, which also impacted the biblical ideas and biblical ideals. And so that was the first kind of cataclysmic kind of wave in terms of ideologies, philosophies, and worldviews. Not, of course, there are other historical events, of course, military conquest and things like that I'm not talking about, but I'm really talking about cultural impact. The second one, which is arguably even greater, is the Alexandria Museum, or the Alexandria Place of the Muses, and in which there was also a library, which is the famous Library of Alexandria. Alexandria was built under King Ptolemy I, who was a childhood friend of Alexander III, or Alexander the Great, and both of them studied under Aristoteles. Okay, so both of them studied philosophy and were believers, so to speak, in that world. And they built Alexandria, or Ptolemy at least built Alexandria to implement that philosophy. This was a modern city in many ways. It was revolutionary. It had a grid system for the streets. It had all kinds of things that people did not see before. For example, its temples had an automatically opening door that was hydraulically manipulated so that it would automatically open and shut. It seemed like a futuristic city, but the main thing there was its really vibrant philosophical and scientific community. So they developed this museum, the Place of the Muses, with the library in it, and this is the first library in the history of the world. Now, we talk about the Library of Ashur-banipal. We talk about other libraries as well that were earlier, but these were really archives. They're not libraries in the sense that this term took after Alexandria. The difference between a library and an archive is an archive is a place where you simply deposit texts, maybe to train scribes or simply to have the records kept. That's an archive, and that's all it is. People don't study necessarily the text critically. They don't try to take out books and compare it to other books and study them critically and find the different editions necessarily of these texts. Alexandria did that, and that is a major difference. The library was a living organism, so to speak, unlike the archive, which you can see just as a parable. The archive is where you bury the text. In Alexandria, in the library, the texts are alive, and people study them and compare them to other texts and compare them to other copies of the same text and find discrepancies, for example, and try to harmonize these texts and things like that. And so that was a major intellectual event in the ancient world. It impacted everything. And it impacted the Greeks. Again, keep in mind that these were the Macedonians, not the Greeks that built Alexandria. But it impacted the Greek mainland. It impacted the Persian areas as well. The Parthians, of course, the Egyptians and the Yahwists as well. And the Yahwists at the time were under Ptolemaic rule, so they were within the same administrative system and with the same really ruler as Alexandria was. And in Alexandria, there were a lot of Yahwists or Jews at the time. And so if you wanted to be where the intellectual kind of cutting edge was happening, you would go to Alexandria. Now, as I said, in Alexandria, they developed methods to harmonize different versions of texts, to complete texts, to add different versions to text or sequels and things like that. So there was a very, very conscious effort around the ancient texts to make them better, to make them more complete, to have them serve different purposes, and etc. And it is this trigger, this intellectual trigger, I believe, that caused the Jews or the Yahwists at the time to come together again under the exact same structure. They were there. They were in the same. They didn't have to go from the Seleucid Empire to the Ptolemaic Empire to do this. It was under the same structure. That is the trigger that caused them to say, okay, well, the Greeks are doing that and the Macedonians are doing that on their Greek texts or the Greek oral traditions. We want to do this on our traditions and our texts, and if need be, also compose additional texts that either fill in the gaps or glue different texts together, or simply reflect their own day. So I think the Alexandria Library or the Alexandria Museum was the cataclysmic event, the trigger that caused the Torah and eventually the Bible to be written down. Yeah. Now we see this because, as I said earlier, before Alexandria, before the beginning of the 3rd century, there is nothing anywhere. We don't see even the slightest hint of knowledge of the Bible, biblical literature, anything. But we do start to see this then. Okay, as I said, the tail end of the 4th century and later. We see it clearly on the onomasticon, in the names of people, in quotes, in idiomatic expressions. We start seeing this slowly. I mean, again, we see very little in the 1st century. In the 3rd century, we see it more in the 2nd century. But we start seeing this more and more after Alexandria, and we see nothing before. So as a historian, this trigger is very compelling. Okay, as a historian, the trigger of Alexandria, because historians, we always look for triggers. What caused things to change? What caused things to veer off course or to develop and adapt? Because there was always you have to have something to cause this. It might be internal, it might be external. And this is so compelling, especially since the first echoes also that we have are from Egypt, are from Jews in Egypt, or Yahwists in Egypt. And so this is a very, very compelling, and this is the book that I'm working on now. And so this and the book, I mean, the title that I have for the book is Under the Ptolemaic Sun. And what I mean by that, it's a wordplay on nothing new under the sun. And the idea is that, the Ptolemies did supply something new under the sun that eventually made this entire endeavor of writing what became the Bible possible.
So what do you think caused the inception of the Torah?
What do you mean by that?
Why was it written down at all? What was the point of it?
Well, I mean, as I said, it was written down because the Yahwists basically saw what was going on with the Greek texts, and they wanted to do it for their own tradition, whether it was orally transmitted or already some of it written down. They wanted to take these different traditions, again, textual or oral, and compare, contrast, and apply exactly the same processes that were applied to the Greek texts to their own traditions. So that was the trigger. That was the inception of the Torah and the biblical texts in general. Now, let me go back. As I said, some of the texts that did make it, of course, to the Bible are clearly older than the 3rd century. I'm not saying that everything dates from the 3rd century BCE. In fact, I have an article on that came out last year on the oracles against the nations in Amos, in the book of Amos. And I date only that part, not the entire book, but only that part, the oracles against the nations, to the end of the 8th century, beginning of the 7th century BCE, because I show that the school that developed, or whomever wrote that portion of the book, which I believe was transmitted orally for a while, but whomever composed that knew very, very intimately, was very intimately familiar with Neo-Assyrian propaganda of the time, okay, and actually very precise on this. And so whomever wrote that or composed that or created that was very familiar with Neo-Assyrian propaganda. So that allows me to, I mean, such a level of precision allows me to date this to that period. I mean, late 8th, early 7th century BC. So that's clearly a text that made it into Bible that is much older. And there are certain texts, and again, you can never date an entire book to a certain period because there's so much redaction and addition in each one of these books. You can only date certain portions if you have something to compare it to extra biblically. Now, another thing, there's a lot of data in the books of Kings, for example. Again, we're not in the Torah now, but in the books of Kings, a lot of data that does correspond to what we know extra biblically especially from the Neo-Assyrian Empire, different rulers. And so we know that certain events do correspond very well and are probably related to an historical event. That does not mean that they were necessarily composed when that event happened, because one thing we can be sure of, even though we have no record of it, is that Yahwistic temples were also archives in antiquity. Now, when I say Yahwistic temples, of course, we already talked about the one kind of mentioned in passing, the one in Elephantine. But there, of course, was at least one Yahwistic temple in Jerusalem and one in Mount Gerizim in Samaria and probably in the city of Samaria as well. So we had a number of Yahwistic temples. Temples in antiquity usually have archives. And so in those archives, you could find scribes who now wanted to compose these texts, would find records that they can use for inspiration to create. And again, I'm speculating here, but what it is certain, I mean, there is no temple, practically no temple without some or main temple without some sort of archive in antiquity. So temples were administrative centers, and so we can assume, I think, very safely that there was an archive in a long-standing archive in the major temples, at least in Jerusalem and in Samaria. And so you can use that in order to have, you can use that even after, after you're influenced and energized by the Alexandria model. You can use that to build different stories around it.
And what about the Moses story and the Exodus? What are your thoughts on that?
So there is no, I'm not the first to say it, and a lot of scholars agree that there is no evidence whatsoever for the Exodus. And I personally don't think we should look for actual historical evidence for it. It's a story. And in antiquity, this is a very modern preoccupation that these stories have to be historical. As I always mentioned when we talk about when we discuss also with my students these questions, the Romans had no problem at the height of their power with Augustus. Augustus commissioned Virgil to write the mythology of the Roman Empire as people who are people who was birthed from one man, from Aeneas, who was a soldier fighting in Troy. Okay, and that idea, and again, that idea is older than Augustus. We find it also already in the late 2nd century BC, elements of it. But he commissioned, I mean, again, an empire at the height of its power at that time, commissions a single person to write basically the equivalent of the Torah. Okay, the Aeneids are the equivalent in length of the Torah in 10 years. It took that one person 10 years to do it, writing with pre-existing material, working with pre-existing material, and using different versions, different elements, and combining that in order to create the Aeneids. Something similar happened here with the Jewish people. And so we should not look at the fact that the Exodus is a mythological tale as something that is any less than what Augustus did as well. I mean, that is how people in antiquity thought. Okay, and so creating a myth of your foundation is not something is certainly not something that was something to be ashamed of, certainly in antiquity. So the Exodus should be looked, I think, using the lens of antiquity rather than modern lens that really wants this to be absolute history. So that's on the Exodus. Another element, of course, in the Exodus is an important element of the story is Moses, the figure of Moses. And again, if we were to go back to the early 3rd century, or the turn of the 3rd century, we would find at least 5 different Moses stories that are very different from one another. Okay, so if we were to go back then, we would be very, very conscious of the fact that the Moses story is not yet codified. Okay, it's not yet standardized. There are many different stories circulating about a person called Moses. I don't necessarily know that this is an Egyptian name, Moses. Okay, Moshe is an element of an Egyptian name. Okay, but it is never recorded alone. Okay, so you have Moshe, for example, but you never have Moshe as an Egyptian name alone. in antiquity, in the Greek world, in the Hellenistic world, they understood Moshe as muse, okay, as the muse or the father of muses, or the teacher of Orpheus. Okay, he was considered, one of the stories around him is that he is the teacher of Orpheus. Another story was that he was a magush, one of the magi of that period, and kind of an alchemist, okay, like a magician. That also is echoed in the biblical text, right? He throws down his staff and things, and that creates certain things. And so that idea is also echoed in the biblical text. Other texts show him to be a mighty military leader fighting against the Ethiopians, basically the Cushites of the time. So there are many different stories circulating, completely different stories circulating at the time. Even if we go into the 2nd century BCE, there is Ezekiel the Tragedian. Okay, and Ezekiel the Tragedian was a Jew from Alexandria who wrote an absolutely standard Greek tragedy. That was, we have no reason to believe that it was not actually performed in the amphitheater there in Alexandria. But he wrote a Greek tragedy on the Exodus. But it is not exactly the Exodus that we have. It's different. It combines Moses as a military leader against the Ethiopians with what we know. So even in the 2nd century BCE, the stories were not yet completely settled. The narrative was not completely settled. It was still being developed. It was still being polemicized. There was still internal polemics about who Moses is, about what is this Exodus, what is the myth surrounding it, etc. So I think when we look at all of the data together, it is clear that the Exodus myth came into being late, and was standardized rather late. And of course, the person of Moses and the stories around him were also likewise late, probably starting to standardize somewhere around the turn of the 1st century BC.
When you talk about these different versions of Moses that were in circulation before the standardized text of the Torah was officially canon and pushed out for everybody to read as the mainstream text. Are we talking about certain individuals like Hecataeus and others that mention Moses,
Yep.
but they don't mention him writing anything? No Torah, no nothing.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So Hecataeus of Abera, of course, mentions, but again, that is that source that I said, one of these sources that is mentioned much later. So we have to take it with a grain of salt. But yeah, and only quoted. We don't have any work of his actually surviving. So that's one of these sources. Yeah, and we have different sources preserved on this Moses tradition, and of course also Ezekiel the Tragedian. Yeah. Now, you use the word canon of the Torah or the biblical text. Different versions were circulating and were seen as authoritative to a certain degree into the Common Era by different groups and different people. One thing that is really important to realize is that the texts were not considered sacred. They were considered authoritative, but they were not sacred. The concept of a sacred text did not exist well into the Common Era. And of course, the proof of that is that people had no problem going into the text and adapting it to their own, to whatever ideology that they happened to have, or their group happened to have. And of course, we see that in Qumran, in different versions of different texts. And so the texts were not yet considered sacred in the sense that you cannot modify them and adapt them. And people doing that believe that they are inspired in doing so. Okay. They did not feel that they are abusing the trust of anyone, but they believe that they were inspired, divinely inspired, if you want, but certainly right in retouching the text and adapting it to a more precise or more orthodox, with a small o, worldview.
Can you tell us more about this text? What exactly is this text that portrays Moses as a magus, a magician?
So it's so the text basically shows him as a I forget the exact reference for that text, but it shows him as someone who deals with alchemy, and he is mentioned together with other magi like that, who deal with alchemy. So like Apollodex and others as well. So there are a number of magi like that, like the top magi, people who can really do anything and can influence the world and can do all kinds of magic to change reality, and Moses was among them. Keep in mind that we only have fragments, so we don't have a narrative where he is a magush. We don't have a story about him doing, but we do have him mentioned as one of the main magi of the time.
So by which point did the Torah finally become a standardized text?
Very late. I mean, as a standardized text, the question is, what do you mean by standardized text? Because
Hmm.
there were, keep in mind that the Torah, so there were different versions of the Torah circulating. Of course, you also had the Samaritan Torah as well. In some, we call it Proto-Samaritan in Qumran studies, or Samaritan, but we do find that in Qumran, the people in Qumran, or the people writing it, were not Samaritans. But they had a text that was very similar to what we eventually find in the Samaritan Torah. We also need to keep in mind what is called the Septuagint, or the translation of the 70, which, if my dating is correct, that translation happened almost simultaneously with the actual authoring of the Torah in Alexandria. Okay, so almost simultaneously, they're about the 3rd century BCE. So almost immediately after the Hebrew version was composed, or in parallel to it, the Greek version was also composed. And so those different versions competed for a long period of time, and we have them continuing to compete well into the Common Era. I mean, a kind of tongue-in-cheek response to that. It is, admittedly, exaggerated, but not completely. Is that the standardized version came when Gutenberg invented the printing press, because it was at that point that you had one source, right? That printing press is one source, and it does not rely on copyists copying and potentially adapting the text, right? So once you've removed the copyist from the equation, you can really start talking about a standardized text. But obviously, the text was technically standardized before that, probably several centuries before that, but not by much. Not by much. Now we have we have an example for this, or a very good hint, because with the Tiberian tradition, or the Masoretic Tiberian tradition, that created the texts of the Torah that we find, for example, in the Leningrad Codex and other codices like that. So that's around 10th century of the Common Era. Now, what they did is they added diacritics, they added cantillation marks, they added all kinds of and I call that process a translation from Hebrew to Hebrew. Okay, what they did is they took the earlier Hebrew form that did not have vowel marks, they did not have these diacritics. They took that form of the Hebrew text and added an interpretative layer on top of that in many ways affected the meaning of the text. So already even in the 10th century of the Common Era, that text was still worked on and changing. Okay, that is the Tiberius Masoretic tradition. That is what we use in our Hebrew Bibles today, or an offshoot of that is what we use in our Hebrew Bibles today. That is a development from the 10th century, okay? And so, or the 9th century, 10th century, okay? So we have that, so it was well into the Common Era that the text of the Bible in general, but of course of the Pentateuch as well, was still being modified, not to the extent that it was in the earlier centuries, but significantly. And I'd say that the Masoretes, okay, that school from Tiberius that added all of these interpretative layers with the diacritics or the vowel markings, that is a massive undertaking, and it did in many places change the meaning of verses or words, and change the entire meaning of the message that was being brought out. And so that, again, very late, still being worked on, still being developed.
So would you say that the translation of the 70, the Septuagint, is obviously closer to the original text, if it is the case that it was written nearly simultaneously with the composition of the autograph copy?
Correct. Correct. And keep in mind, again, I just want to reiterate, Augustus wanted Virgil to write an equivalent of the Torah in terms of number of words or lines, and he did that one person 10 years. Okay, so things like that, when you have a concentrated effort, you can write it very quickly, and especially if you have more than one person working on this. So yeah, I mean, certainly these things could have happened very quickly within a matter of a couple of decades, 2 or 3, or maybe half a century.
So what does this do to the documentary hypothesis? In your view, does this in any way hinder the documentary hypothesis, or does it significantly change it? What's your thoughts?
So the documentary hypothesis is really, many scholars, I'd say most biblical scholars, are already way beyond the documentary hypothesis. Usually we talk about P and not P, and again, even the definition of what P is, the priestly corpus, is debated. I'd rather, and again, based on my research that I just shared with you, I'd rather not look at P or not P or non-P or the documentary hypothesis. I think they are too simplistic. The biblical text is a battlefield. That's the way to look at it. And it is a battlefield between different sects at different times, putting in their ideas and eventually getting them through into posterity. Okay, but you have layers upon layers of redaction and addition and amplification and harmonization. And it is a battlefield of ideas because it is a text that defines identity. And so people were literally fighting to express their identity, the identity of their sect, of their school, of the rulers, of the Hasmoneans, that had a huge impact, of course, on the development of the Bible and the development of the Torah. And so the biblical text is a battlefield, and that's why I look at elements within the biblical text that can be isolated, and you need to really look at them very, very closely and understand where do you draw the lines, where does a certain layer begin, and so we have a lot more complexity. Within or above that complexity, to kind of give it some frame, I like within the Torah. And if you look at the documentary hypothesis, you're talking about the Torah. Within the Torah, I distinguish really two layers that are, from my perspective, interesting. One is the narrative layer, the layer of the stories from Genesis, the stories, which continue basically the myth, the mythology that is being developed over time, and another layer which is a set of rules, or a halacha, if you will, that is encrusted into the text in strategic points. Okay, so we really have a narrative layer, and we have a halacha layer, or a layer of laws that is obviously important as well. But the narrative layer in Genesis is the main layer by far, and into the beginning of Exodus, and then latter part of Exodus, it kind of starts to go more into the laws, and then of course Leviticus is almost all laws, and you have Numbers that goes back into kind of the narrative, combines that with laws, and of course Deuteronomy that does the same. But I think that is where I personally would rather look at this as narrative with a system of laws, or a set of laws that are also evolving, encrusted within this narrative, and the narrative kind of enveloping it, rather than certain documentary hypotheses, which I don't think really carry much weight anymore. It's not like there was a document. I mean, when you talk about a documentary hypothesis, you say, well, there was a document here, document there, and they combine it here. They took it, all of it from this document. This passage comes from the other document, and in this passage, they actually had to somehow harmonize or treat that text in different ways. I don't think that these documents as such necessarily existed. Much of the narrative story is very late. Within the legal framework, I think that's an earlier phase. But again, we can talk about that. But I have a completely different and unique, in that sense, perspective on this. But I think most scholars have already gone way past the documentary hypothesis. We realize it's not enough, and even within the P and not P school, we understand that things are significantly more complex.
And so, do you see these layers that you're talking about as more of being an oral scenario, or are they lost texts that were compiled together when the Torah was being first assembled?
That's a great question. I don't have a good answer on this. I don't know if it was oral or written. In any case, it was not widely known. Whether it was oral or written down, we have, as I said, we have zero evidence that people knew it. The ordinary people, ordinary Yahwists or Jews, knew anything about the Torah, for example. So, I mean, whether it's oral or written, they should have. We would have expected them to know something about it. So clearly, it was not authoritative. It was not widely disseminated. And I agree with my friend Professor Jonathan Adler, that we really need to look at what the ordinary people did and what they knew, and there is simply no support that there was like this elite group that was authoritative, and actually communicated anything with the ordinary people. So that theory that there was some kind of elite that conserved these texts and somehow held on to them is also not supported by any data. It might have been, but we don't have any data to support it. So the short answer is I don't know. Certain texts are clearly older. Okay, and like I said, the text from the Oracles Against the Nations in Amos, not the text from the Torah, is certainly older, and I'm very confident dating that particular part of Amos, only the first chapter and a half of it, to the late 8th and beginning of the 7th century. But every text needs to be analyzed, and in many cases we have no idea of knowing. But in the Torah specifically, I think that the laws that are in it are more were kept in different places as laws, as a law code of some sort, not necessarily in the form that we know them from the Bible, but something along these lines. And some of them are very similar to other law codes that we had in the area, in the Levant, or in Mesopotamia, or even the Hammurabi Codex. We have, or the Hammurabi Code. So we have the law code seems to be earlier, and it was enveloped by a narrative that begins that doesn't necessarily begin, but a narrative that was kind of glued together to form Genesis, Exodus, and of course Numbers, and into Deuteronomy. From the narrative perspective, again, Leviticus has almost no narrative. Narrative, I mean no story per se. It's all just a set of laws.
And given your dating of the Torah, do you see Hellenistic ideas also being influential on the formation of the Torah in tandem with Achaemenid ideas?
Absolutely. So the big one, the main one, is the fact that the narrative itself. It was very fashionable, or very common in the Hellenistic world, for a people to portray itself as coming from the East. Okay, many Greek polis did that, and they portray, and of course the Romans did that as well, right? With Aeneas coming from Troy to Rome. Okay, so to portray a people, the ethnogenesis of a people, as coming from the East, meaning being ancient in the view of the ancient world, is a very Hellenistic idea, very Hellenistic ethos, which again was very influential on Rome as well. We find it earlier in the Greek world, but also Rome adopted exactly the same ideal. Okay, and so the idea of the patriarchs, right, Abraham coming from the East, right, and only all the patriarchs have to pick a wife from the East as well, and the idea of the nation being brought in from the East, that is a very Hellenistic thing to do. Okay, very Hellenistic storyline, and fits very well with Hellenistic sensibilities. In fact, you have that as a Hellenistic kind of not subtext, but narrative, and then you have the Exodus narrative meeting this narrative also from the East. The idea is that you have to come in from the East. That makes so the story takes the children of Israel all the way to the East in order for them to enter at the same point in which Abraham entered according to this narrative. So you see that these narratives combine at some point. And I think that the narrative of the patriarch was somewhat, by a very, very short amount of time, but a little bit earlier than that part of the Exodus narrative that seeks to connect it to that, to entering the land from the east, and so and assembling in Shechem, in this place that Abraham came to as well, and of course Joseph and Jacob, and so these narratives show this. And again, now we're talking about the entire Torah practically, right? The Exodus and the narrative of the patriarchs is fundamentally a Hellenistic ideal in that sense, in the sense of the geographic progression of the nation, the ethnogenesis of the nation.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Gad Barnea.
My pleasure.
And I want to remind everybody to check out the History Valley Amazon affiliate link to purchase his book, Yahwism Under the Achaemenid Empire. And the link to purchase it is in the description below, and it will be in the pinned comment. Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.